different realities or ontologies. With respect to the group I know best, the Kawaiwete, a people who have relocated to the Xingu Park from more heavily colonized areas to the west in the Tapajos River area, multinaturalism could be said to characterize the domains of myth and shamanism. In the deep forest, underwater, and at the horizon live vestiges of beings that populated the earth in mythic times, before humans and animals divaricated. These ancient and powerful beings, called the true animals, control and watch over everyday animals of the forest, who are considered to be their pets or their children. The true animals take human souls in revenge for the animals killed in the hunt. The souls of the sick, the dead, and the unborn are kept as their pets or children until shaman can negotiate their return to the human world. Aspects of what we would call part of the natural environment are always en route to becoming transformed into the human, and vice versa. And rather than simply calories, animals are also non-human subjectivities. Surprisingly, the Kawaiwete are not, as a result, vegetarians. Rather, hunting and predation are central. But moral codes in the form of dietary taboos and rules about the treatment of game, as well as shamanic interventions, guide their engagement with these beings. To quote Viveros de Castro, this sort of ontology causes the human condition to cease being special and to become instead a default mode or a generic condition of any species. The domain of nature also, in essence, disappears. The traditions of many other lowland people can be described in similar terms as presenting a transformational world populated with many kinds of human and non-human persons. Anthropologists such as Alcido Ramos at UNIB and others, based on their respective fieldwork, have observed that perspectivism leads to a dangerous homogenization, a portrayal of very distinctive indigenous traditions in generic terms that are basically an essentialized alter image of the West. Perspectivism has also inspired field research in Siberia, Native North America, Melanesia, as well as beyond, where similar kinds of thought have been identified. This body of work could really, in fact, be said to essentialize a global indigenous thought that is counterposed to that of the West. So, as you can see, it is a little bit, it is not structuralism, but it's inspired by some of the universalist claims of structuralism, although for Eduardo, he splits them into Western and non-Western. And you can see there could be reasons to mind that. Native Amazonian or non-Western perspectivism as such has, however, become a position which some of the positions of capitalist development can be addressed. Perhaps because of its elegance in its formulation or its grounding in myth rather than the complexities of history, because it's not very historical, perspectivism offers a vision of a different kind of world that is possible in the future beyond that of our current world system. As such, it has the potential to galvanize support in industrialized nations for indigenous people and their environments. Shaman, working through translators like Brazilian Davi Kopanawa Yanomami, have become really compelling spokespersons far beyond Amazonia for this other way to live. Multinaturalism also has currency among indigenous activists in Andean countries as a means of uniting people of different traditions in opposition to development projects. With respect to its usefulness in political rhetoric, its pret-a-porter nature, to quote Ramos, is perhaps actually an asset, as is its futurist orientation. With respect to protecting biomes, it's a vision of both an indigenous world and an ideal future where there is no category of the human differentiated from nature, and therefore no human domination of nature. The problem with this, as Lucas Vestager and David Bond have pointed out, is that this multinaturalist world entirely cut off from the West does not exist, save perhaps in myth or this vague future. It leads to an artificial and dangerous perception of Amazonians living in separate realities, when in fact they're entangled in the material problems we all share, the effects of fossil fuels, tailings from mines, DDT, mercury, etc. Perspectivism, they caution, may also lead to a discounting and a non-recognition of indigenous people who are not fully cut off from Western reality. And this is just about everyone, the vast majority of them. They suggest instead to look at people's actual working relations with the natural world. And with respect to the Kamiwete, I've written about a shaman's involvement in the March to the West, or a March para Oeste in mid-century. This particular shaman in Prepari worked with the Brazilian Air Force ground truthing across central Brazil to establish landing strips in the 40s, at the same time as he communicated with the true animals, so that these teams could have game to eat and that their airplanes would not be taken down by heavy winds. He did this, he said, to bring the Kamiwete better medical treatment that the air travel allowed. He also worked with these spirits and with the indigenism of the Villas Boas brothers to help set up the Xingu Indigenous Park. Finding how indigenous alterity is entangled and enmeshed with goals and projects shared across ethnic boundaries provides a more realistic template for how conservation or development projects, sustainable or otherwise, involving indigenous peoples have worked or not worked to protect biomes. One current interesting project sponsored by the Instituto Socioambiental is the production of organic honey in the Xingu, made from both the Africanized bees' honeys as well as the stingless Amazonian bees' honeys, those are plural. This honey is produced in the Xingu and sold to a grocery store chain, the Pão de Açúcar, for profit. While Kayabi had experience with native stingless bees and gathering their honey, the art of beekeeping was new, very much a Western craft. According to Simone Accialti and her co-authors, this venture has also led to the documentation of the interaction of native and European bees and the monitoring of forest blooms in the Xingu. It has led, including to a discovery by Kayabi shaman of a new spirit that controls and watches over the European bees. In conclusion, while archaeology, cultural ecology, perspectivism, and its critics can all contribute to conceptualizing biomes and work towards their protection, they do it in different ways, or have done it in different ways. Archaeology and cultural ecology produce a fine-grained understanding of humans' roles in particular contexts and their historical trajectories. Perspectivism, a bit actually like the archaeology of the 70s, which theorized about populations across the whole Amazon basin, deals in broad generalities that are ahistorical, but it has a clear rhetorical appeal, and it can be used as a platform for activism against destructive development projects. Critiques of perspectivism document the way environmental protection or degradation can happen in a more historically specific way across interethnic divides and conceptual worlds. These approaches provide a realistic idea about how these joint ventures can work or maybe don't work. So in short, Brazil and research in Brazil has been really important for reconceptualizing the biome.
We have a few minutes for questions for Suzanne, and then we'll open to a general discussion. Yes?
You use the word perspectivism a lot. I just Googled it and didn't come up with a definition, so could you define it?
A definition. That was that big long paragraph in there. Did you find it though as you Googled it? Did it come up as a word? No. It's coined by this anthropologist, Eduardo Viegas de Castro at the Museo Nacional. And what he means by that is this, first he started saying it's just sort of he used Amerindian is the term he used, an Amerindian thought versus a Western thought. And the way he defines it is that we in the West have nature versus culture. And these Amerindians don't have that split. Instead, they view all creatures as equally cultural, but they have different bodies, and therefore view the world differently. So whereas humans I mean, whereas Westerners talk about culture as the thing that differentiates humans and nature, Amerindians don't have that term, and they think more in terms of perspectivism, and that would be the definition. It is very much like Levi-Straussian structuralism of the past in the sense that it's very elegant and very kind of generic at the same time, and it's also based. He knows just an amazing amount about all the literature that has come out of the lowlands. So it's not something that he just started with from, an alter image of the West, but that's what he ended up with. So it's sort of hunting for these it's not a universal because it's the West and the non-West, but it hunts for this very rich ethnographic terrain. So it's kind of paradoxical in the way Levi-Strauss was. He came up with these really kind of banal universals about the human mind, but he did it by going through all of this detailed ethnography. So you could never say, oh, well, it's just an alter image of the West, it's ridiculous. It's based on a lot of empirical data from myth. So it's a curious, and it's taken the world by storm. I mean, really, if you want to talk about a Brazilian impacting something made anthropology in the last 20 years, this is it. This is what Brazilian anthropology is bringing to really the world. It is caught on like wildfire in Europe. U.S. is a bit, mixed on it, but definitely is interested. It's huge. So I'm kind of surprised it didn't come up with Google, but I'm not sure what they would have written. I don't know what you find on Wikipedia, but
Google is not the end of the world. And just a brief question, and we
sorry, that was a
will
very
start,
long answer.
we'll start with our general discussion. Yeah, one brief question.
Okay, no, I was just very curious about that topic of perspectivism, Eliezer Castro, and the critique, because one of the critiques that you mentioned is that it disconnects the indigenous peoples of the Amazon from the West, let's say.
Yeah.
But when we read David Kopenawa, he is able to go back and forth. I mean, he's very cosmopolitan, and that kind of so it doesn't have to be. And at the same time, he coincides with Eliezer Castro. I mean, he describes it very elegantly too. So, I guess my question would be like, what kind of this kind of new intellectual, indigenous intellectual, how rather than just the anthropologists how can we collaborate with them, and you as anthropologists and etc.
Well, I think the thing about Davi Kopenawa is there's kind of a feedback loop between he and Eduardo, because Eliezer Castro read his narratives, and that gave him information to think about perspectivism. So it's not a surprise that it looks very much like, oh wow, here it is again. I think perspectivism, given my long answer to what is it, I think it's really tricky to try to necessarily work with indigenous intellectuals.
Use the microphone.
I think it's really tricky to try to explain all that with at least, say, intellectuals in the Xingu. I know I have tried it, and it's not always super easy, but you can see in the Andean countries, it's something that has been picked up by, say, urban indigenous intellectuals, and they really have run with it because it is really rhetorically useful and interesting, and it galvanizes people. So I don't quite know the answer, I guess. It's a complicated answer, and I don't even know it.
All right, good way to answer the question then. Thank you very much.